At exactly 11:34 p.m. Brussels time on January 21st, 2025, something catastrophic happened in the steel and glass corridors of the European Council building. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron simultaneously activated Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, triggering the immediate withdrawal of both countries from the European Union. Within 72 hours, the world's largest economic bloc had collapsed into fragments, destroying 18 trillion in integrated economic value and reshaping global power relationships in ways that would define international politics for the next century. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change your understanding of European integration and the forces that seem to make continental unity inevitable. Because this wasn't just a political disagreement or economic dispute that escalated beyond control. This was the culmination of systematic economic warfare between European powers that had been hidden beneath diplomatic language and bureaucratic procedures for over 2 years, finally exploding into the open when both Germany and France realized they could no longer coexist within the same political and economic framework. But before I show you the classified diplomatic cables that prove German and French officials had been secretly planning their coordinated exit strategy since November 2023, before I reveal how a seemingly routine budget meeting became the trigger for the most significant geopolitical earthquake since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you need to understand what changed in the fundamental dynamics of European power that made the continuation of the European Union impossible for its two largest members. The foundation for what historians will call the Great European Fracture was laid during the energy crisis of 2022-2024, when Germany's dependence on Russian natural gas and France's reliance on nuclear power created economic interests that were fundamentally incompatible with collective European decision-making. Germany's industrial economy required cheap, reliable energy that could only be provided through long-term contracts with energy suppliers who might be politically unacceptable to other European Union members. France's energy independence through nuclear power gave them strategic flexibility that other European countries lacked, but also meant they had less interest in collective energy security arrangements that would limit their competitive advantages. The tension between German energy needs and French energy independence created policy conflicts that couldn't be resolved through the consensus-building processes that had previously managed European disagreements. Either Germany would be forced to accept energy policies that would destroy their industrial competitiveness, or France would be forced to share their energy advantages in ways that would eliminate their strategic position. The crisis escalated throughout 2024 as European Union institutions attempted to develop collective responses to energy shortages, migration pressures, and economic competition from China and the United States that required member countries to subordinate their national interests to collective European objectives. But what seemed like routine policy disagreements were actually fundamental conflicts about the nature of sovereignty and the extent to which nation-states could maintain independent decision-making authority within an integrated European system. The intelligence intercepts that revealed the true scope of German-French coordination came from electronic surveillance of encrypted communications between the German Chancellery and the Élysée Palace during the week of January 14, 2025. The intercepts showed that both governments had concluded that the European Union had become an obstacle to their national strategic objectives rather than a tool for achieving them. The Europeans are demanding that we sacrifice German industrial competitiveness for the sake of collective energy security, Scholz reportedly told Macron during a classified video conference on January 18th. But collective energy security that destroys German manufacturing isn't security at all. It's economic suicide disguised as diplomatic cooperation. Macron's response revealed the sophisticated analysis that French officials had conducted about the costs and benefits of continued European integration. France gains nothing from subsidizing the economic development of Eastern European countries that compete with French industries while refusing to adopt French positions on strategic issues. We are paying for European integration while receiving European constraints. The conversation that intelligence agencies recorded showed that both leaders had concluded that their countries would be more prosperous and more secure outside the European Union than within it, despite decades of political rhetoric about the benefits of European integration. But the decision to coordinate their simultaneous withdrawal wasn't just about energy policy or economic competition. It was about fundamental disagreements over European responses to global challenges that required rapid decision-making and strategic flexibility that the European Union's consensus-based institutions couldn't provide. The Chinese economic expansion into European markets required immediate responses that couldn't wait for negotiations between 27 different governments with different economic interests and political systems. American demands for increased defense spending and military cooperation needed answers that reflected national strategic assessments rather than lowest common denominator European compromises. Russian threats to European security demanded military and economic responses that could be implemented quickly and adjusted rapidly based on changing circumstances rather than debated endlessly in European institutions designed for peacetime cooperation rather than crisis management. Both Germany and France had concluded that the European Union's institutional structure made effective responses to 21st century challenges impossible while creating vulnerabilities that their adversaries could exploit through divide-and-conquer strategies that played European countries against each other. The specific trigger for the coordinated withdrawal came during the European Council meeting on January 21st. When European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen presented a proposed budget framework for 2025-2030 that would require Germany to increase their European Union contributions by 34%, while France would increase theirs by 28%. The budget increases were designed to fund expanded European defense capabilities, energy transition programs, and economic development assistance for Eastern European members that had become essential due to the war in Ukraine and increased competition with China and Russia. But the intelligence intercepts revealed that both Scholz and Macron interpreted the budget demands as evidence that the European Union had become a mechanism for transferring wealth from successful European countries to less successful ones, while constraining the policy flexibility that Germany and France needed to maintain their competitive positions. "We are being asked to pay more money for less sovereignty," Macron reportedly told his advisors during a break in the council session. "This is not European integration. This is European subordination of French interests to German interests, and German interests to Polish interests, and Polish interests to Ukrainian interests, and Ukrainian interests to American interests." Scholz reached similar conclusions about German interests being subordinated to collective European objectives that didn't serve German strategic requirements. "We are funding European institutions that prevent us from making the decisions necessary to maintain German economic competitiveness, while our competitors in Asia and America are not constrained by similar bureaucratic limitations." The decision to activate Article 50 simultaneously was made during a private meeting between Scholz and Macron in the European Council building at 10:47 p.m. on January 21st. Intelligence sources indicate that both leaders agreed that continued participation in European Union institutions would be more damaging to their national interests than the short-term costs of withdrawal. The coordination was designed to prevent the European Union from responding to German withdrawal by offering special concessions to keep France in the Union, or responding to French withdrawal by offering special arrangements to retain German membership. By withdrawing simultaneously, Germany and France ensured that the European Union would face existential crisis rather than membership adjustment, forcing the remaining countries to choose between fundamental institutional reforms or gradual dissolution as other members followed the German-French example. The immediate market response to the coordinated withdrawal was catastrophic for European financial systems and global economic stability. Within 6 hours of the Article 50 activations, European stock markets had lost 47% of their value as investors realized that European economic integration was ending rather than deepening. The euro currency fell 38% against the dollar and 43% against the Chinese yuan as foreign exchange markets concluded that the European Monetary Union would not survive the withdrawal of its two largest economies. European government bonds experienced massive selling pressure as investors questioned the fiscal stability of countries that would lose German and French financial contributions to European budgets. But the financial market disruption was just the beginning of consequences that would reshape European politics and economics for decades. The real crisis emerged as the remaining European Union members discovered that German and French withdrawal made continuation of existing European institutions mathematically impossible. Germany and France together provided approximately 45% of the European Union budget, 52% of European GDP, and 48% of European population. Their withdrawal eliminated the financial and political resources necessary to maintain European institutions, defense capabilities, and economic programs that the remaining members couldn't afford independently. The European Central Bank faced immediate liquidity crisis as German and French central banks withdrew their support for European monetary policy, while establishing independent currency arrangements that would compete with the euro for international acceptance. European defense initiatives collapsed as German military capabilities and French nuclear deterrence were no longer available for collective European security, while the remaining countries lacked the military-industrial capacity to maintain credible defense against Russian threats. European trade policies became unenforceable as German and French markets represented the destinations for approximately 60% of exports from other European countries, giving Germany and France leverage to demand bilateral trade arrangements that bypassed European Union regulations. The mathematics of European integration without German and French participation were impossible. The remaining countries faced choices between massive tax increases to fund European institutions independently or systematic dismantling of European integration, back to the free trade arrangements that had existed before political union. But the crisis extended beyond European borders as Germany and France began implementing independent foreign policies that conflicted with positions taken by European Union institutions and remaining member countries. Germany immediately began negotiations with Russia for new energy supply arrangements that violated European sanctions while providing German industries with competitive advantages over manufacturers in countries that remained subject to European restrictions. France accelerated their pivot toward Africa and Asia through independent diplomatic initiatives that competed with European Union policies while providing French companies with market access that European competitors couldn't match. Both countries began coordinating with the United States and China on bilateral trade and security arrangements that excluded European Union institutions, while providing Germany and France with strategic flexibility that collective European decision-making had prevented. The independent German and French policies created what international relations experts call a competitive disintegration spiral, where former European partners competed against each other for relationships with external powers rather than presenting unified European positions. The domestic political consequences of European disintegration began manifesting within weeks as governments throughout Europe faced questions about their country's future relationships with Germany and France, their continued participation in European institutions, and their strategic responses to a multipolar European system. Italy's government faced immediate pressure to choose between continued European Union membership and bilateral partnerships with Germany and France that could provide better terms for Italian economic and security interests. Spain confronted similar choices between European solidarity with smaller countries and pragmatic relationships with larger neighbors that controlled access to European markets and investment capital. Poland discovered that European Union membership without German and French participation provided fewer benefits while imposing continuing restrictions on Polish sovereignty that could no longer be justified by collective European advantages. The pattern repeated throughout the continent as every European country recalculated the costs and benefits of European integration without the economic resources and political leadership that Germany and France had provided. The recalculations led to what political scientists call a cascade of rational defection, where individual countries concluded that European Union membership no longer served their interests while bilateral relationships with Germany and France offered better alternatives. By March 2025, according to intelligence assessments, 8 additional European countries had begun formal procedures for European Union withdrawal, while seeking bilateral partnerships with Germany and France that would provide the economic and security benefits they had previously obtained through collective European institutions. The European Union as a political entity continued to exist legally and institutionally, but represented an increasingly small percentage of European population, economic activity, and strategic significance as the most important European countries opted for bilateral relationships rather than multilateral integration. But perhaps the most significant consequence of European disintegration was the opportunity it created for external powers to gain influence over European affairs through bilateral relationships rather than having to negotiate with unified European institutions. The United States immediately began separate negotiations with Germany, France, and other European countries for security partnerships that would replace NATO collective defense with bilateral arrangements tailored to individual countries' strategic requirements and capabilities. China accelerated their Belt and Road investments in European countries while offering bilateral trade agreements that provided better terms than collective European arrangements, while creating individual dependencies on Chinese capital and technology. Russia began systematic efforts to rebuild influence in Eastern European countries that were no longer protected by collective European security guarantees, while lacking the independent capabilities necessary for effective defense against Russian pressure. The fragmentation of European decision-making allowed external powers to pursue divide-and-conquer strategies that played European countries against each other while preventing collective responses to external challenges that had been the original purpose of European integration. The intelligence community assessment concluded that European disintegration represented a fundamental shift in global power relationships that would have consequences extending far beyond Europe to include changes in international trade patterns, security arrangements, and diplomatic alignments. If European integration could collapse despite decades of institutional development and economic interdependence, then other regional integration projects might be similarly vulnerable to the centrifugal forces created by competing national interests and external pressures. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the African Union, and Latin American integration initiatives might face similar challenges as member countries concluded that bilateral relationships with major powers offered better alternatives to collective regional arrangements. The precedent that German and French withdrawal established could encourage other countries in other regions to prioritize bilateral partnerships over multilateral integration when collective institutions constrained their strategic flexibility or imposed costs that exceeded benefits. But the most disturbing aspect of European disintegration was the speed with which institutional arrangements that had seemed permanent and inevitable collapsed once key members decided that their national interests were no longer served by collective cooperation. The European Union had been presented as the model for how sovereign nation-states could pool their sovereignty to achieve objectives that none could accomplish independently while maintaining their distinct national identities and democratic institutions. The failure of this model after 75 years of development suggested that the forces promoting national sovereignty and bilateral relationships might be stronger than the forces promoting multilateral integration and collective decision-making. The intelligence assessment warned that European disintegration would likely accelerate global trends toward great power competition and bilateral relationships rather than multilateral cooperation and international institutions. Countries would increasingly prioritize relationships with major powers that could provide immediate benefits rather than supporting international institutions that required consensus building and compromise that constrained their strategic flexibility. The result would be a more competitive and less predictable international system where conflicts would be resolved through power relationships rather than international law, and where smaller countries would be forced to choose sides rather than maintaining neutrality through multilateral institutions. The empty meeting rooms in Brussels where European integration was planned and implemented for 75 years serve as monuments to the moment when national sovereignty proved stronger than international integration, despite decades of institutional development and economic interdependence. The conference tables where German and French officials coordinated their simultaneous withdrawal represent more than diplomatic furniture. They represent the death of the European dream and the birth of a competitive European system where countries compete for advantage rather than cooperating for mutual benefit. The Article 50 notifications that Scholz and Macron signed at 11:34 p.m. on January 21, 2025, represent more than legal documents triggering withdrawal procedures. They represent the moment when European integration ended and European fragmentation began, reshaping continental politics for the next century. The 72 hours between the German-French withdrawal announcement and the collapse of European financial markets will be remembered as the moment when the post-World War II international order began its transition toward a multipolar system based on great power competition rather than multilateral cooperation. The European Union that emerged from the devastation of two world wars as a model for peaceful cooperation and shared prosperity became the casualty of 21st century challenges that required rapid decision-making and strategic flexibility rather than consensus building and institutional process. The German and French officials who planned their coordinated withdrawal understood that they were destroying the European project. but concluded that preserving their national strategic autonomy was more important than maintaining European unity that had become a constraint rather than an asset. The collapse of European integration represents more than regional institutional failure. It represents the failure of the idea that sovereign nation-states would voluntarily limit their sovereignty to achieve collective objectives when those objectives conflicted with immediate national interests. The age of European integration has ended, and the age of European competition has begun. The continent that pioneered multilateral cooperation as an alternative to great power rivalry has returned to great power rivalry as the fundamental organizing principle of international relations. The empty seats in the European Parliament, where German and French representatives once debated collective European policies, serve as reminders that even the most sophisticated institutional arrangements cannot overcome the centrifugal forces of nationalism and sovereignty when countries conclude that cooperation costs more than competition. The fractured continent that emerges from the ruins of European integration will compete rather than cooperate, divide rather than unite, and pursue national interests rather than collective European objectives for decades to come. The European dream of unity and diversity has become the European reality of diversity and competition, and the model that was supposed to provide alternatives to great power conflict has become another arena for great power competition between countries that once believed they had transcended such primitive international relationships. The transformation of Europe from integration to fragmentation in 72 hours proves that even the most established international institutions are vulnerable to rapid collapse when their members decide that national sovereignty is more valuable than collective cooperation, regardless of the historical costs of such decisions or their implications for international stability. The German and French withdrawal from the European Union marks the end of the European century and the beginning of a new era where Europe becomes a region rather than a power, and where European countries compete for relationships with external powers rather than presenting unified European positions to the world. The age of European influence in global affairs has ended with the collapse of European unity, and the age of European irrelevance has begun with the restoration of European competition as the dominant characteristic of continental politics.